It's snowing in Washington, D.C., where all the president's men take the stand. Roger Stone, the president's longest-serving political advisor, in court today, where he pleaded not guilty to 7 counts, including obstruction, witness tampering, and lying. The president's former fixer, Michael Cohen, also expected to take the stand. He'll be on Capitol Hill, where he's scheduled to testify under oath in a closed session of the House Intel Committee next Friday after canceling public testimony because of public threats against his family from Donald Trump. As the felons and accused criminals in Trump's orbit get ready to explain or defend their lies to law enforcement officials about their contacts with Russians, former CIA Director John Brennan warns that Mueller is likely closing in on others in Donald Trump's inner circle.
I do think that the next series of indictments or indictments that are going to be coming out are going to give us, in fact, those final clues in maybe that final act.
Now, you referred to the next series of indictments. Why do you believe there will be a next series of indictments?
Well, whether it's one indictment that's going to include the indictments of many people or it's going to come out together. But I do think that Robert Mueller is going to try to bring this to some type of closure in the coming months. And I would find it very hard to believe that other indictments are not going to come down.
Brennan's successor, Regina Haspel, and her counterparts, the men and women who run the nation's top intel agencies, went public today with some inconvenient truths about the nature of Vladimir Putin's regime, stating under oath today that Russia remains committed to meddling in our democracy and undermining democratic institutions.
We expect Russia will continue to wage its information war against democracies and to use social media to attempt to divide our societies.
Is it the IC's assessment that this country's adversaries continue to use U.S. social media platforms as a vehicle for weaponizing disinformation and spreading foreign influence in the United States? Director Wray?
Yes, that's certainly the FBI's assessment. Not only have the Russians continued to do it in 2018, but we've seen indication that they're continuing to adapt their model and that other countries are taking a very interested eye in that approach.
Today's testimony comes as the White House rolls back sanctions imposed on Russia for meddling on Trump's behalf. Just another Tuesday, folks. Here to sort through the day's developments, some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former U.S. Attorney Chuck Rosenberg. Frank Figliuzzi is a former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI. With us at the table, NBC News national political reporter Carol Lee, and Donnie Deutsch joins us for the hour. Let me start with you, Chuck Rosenberg. As Roger Stone was in court today, you have to fight the temptation to feel any sort of numbness around the event of another person who's been in Donald Trump's political arsenal for decades appearing before court to face his, whatever his legal fate will be.
It's becoming remarkably routine, isn't it? And you would think that for any other president at any other time, it would be extraordinary. And so I think you're exactly right. I also think, listening to John Brennan during your introduction, that there's more to come. There are other shoes to drop, not to be too cliched. But I think there's lots of clues out there, Nicole, that Mueller isn't quite done yet.
Well, you never say anything willy-nilly. What are those clues, Chuck?
Well, I think there's a bunch. I mean, we know that the grand jury that Mueller was using was extended for another 6 months. That's clue number one. We know, or at least I think we know, that the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence has not yet provided the Mueller team with all the transcripts of the folks who testified before it. And we know that folks who testified before it have tended to lie. We've seen that before, including with Mr. Stone. We know that when Mr. Stone was arrested, the FBI also executed search warrants. That means that they had probable cause to believe that crimes had been committed, other crimes had been committed, and that evidence of those crimes would be at the locations that they searched. I think there's a whole bunch of threads still to be pulled.
Let me ask you to pick up that thread, if you will, Frank, and just talk about it. It seems to me that the crime of lying to Congress is the crime that knits together people who are entangled in the Southern District of New York investigations and prosecutions and people who are entangled in the Mueller probe.
Yeah, and lying to Congress is just particularly heinous in terms of our system of government because you're essentially lying to the American people. You're lying to us. These are our elected representatives. And the big question behind the lies, Nicole, as many people have been talking about, is why? And is there central coordination and direction to this? We get a hint of some of that when we see Section 12, paragraph 12 of Stone's indictment, and there's this reference by Mueller to senior campaign officials being directed to deal with Stone on the WikiLeaks. So we've seen a hint of direction in the Manafort indictment as well, and running testimony by people. We've seen Cohen make reference to running his testimony by officials. So I'm developing a theory that there has been coordinated efforts to script, to direct falsehoods, and particularly to do so before Congress. And when Cohen shows up and does his thing next Friday, he's got some splaining to do, as they say. He's lied to these people, and he's going to have to correct the record.
I don't want to move on from what you just said and what you're talking about. You're talking about words in the indictments and the sentencing documents from the Mueller probe that allude to these individuals being directed. And I can't help but think about individual one in the sentencing document for Michael Cohen in the Southern District of New York. Turned out to be Donald Trump, who directed, and again, that's the language from the federal prosecutors, a hush money scheme. Do you see that there is a person known to them, but not us yet, who possibly directed these actions?
I do. I don't think, and by the way, I'll happily defer to Chuck, who knows Mueller far more closely than I do. But Mueller is not given to creating intrigue, drama, to teasing us and setting a dramatic stage. If he puts in there that a senior official was directed to do something, if he makes references to this throughout various charging documents, he knows there's a person directing this. He's not, this isn't conjecture, and he likely knows who that is.
Chuck Rosenberg, your name has been invoked. Let me ask you to answer that question for free. But let me also ask you a broader question. If Robert Mueller was still considering or contemplating charging a broader conspiracy, how do the indictments of the Russians, the crimes that Roger Stone has already been charged with, and the fact that Corsi and Credico, Stone associates around the WikiLeaks hack and dump, fit into what could be a larger conspiracy?
Sure. Well, I actually think there is a larger conspiracy. It doesn't mean necessarily that he will charge it. He doesn't have to. It could be part of a report. It could also be part of a counterintelligence investigation. But with respect to the indictment of the Russian military intelligence officials, you see their coordination with WikiLeaks. With respect to the indictment of Roger Stone, you see his coordination with WikiLeaks. What you don't have is that larger conspiratorial circle drawing them all together. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We just don't have it yet. May I also answer the first question, though, Nicole? Yeah, so prosecutors and agents pick the words in their indictments very carefully. Frank is spot on. Every word, every sentence, every paragraph is checked and double-checked and triple-checked. Words are not in indictments haphazardly or recklessly. If there's something in there, they can prove it, either because they have a document or because they have sworn testimony in the grand jury that buttresses exactly what they wrote. So these are not haphazard or reckless words in the indictment. These are words that are backed by evidence and that can be proved to a jury.
Let me put you on the spot, Chuck. You said in this program before that witnesses become subjects, subjects often become targets, targets often become defendants, and defendants often become cooperating witnesses. Not always the case with the president telegraphing, sort of putting his finger on the scale, talking about some witnesses, some subjects, some convicted felons being better than others. I'm thinking of his comments about Paul Manafort as compared to Michael Cohen. How does that figure into the Stone prosecution?
Sure. So, I mean, you just used the word often. I think I use the word often, but not always. Not all defendants become convicted felons, and not all convicted felons become cooperators. Almost all do. Stone seems to be cut from a different cloth. He's an odd guy, to put it nicely, Nicole. And so it's not at all clear to me that he even understands the nature and seriousness of this. He seemed to be, he seemed to be making a game out of it when he came out of the Florida courthouse. We'll see if a conversation or two with his new defense counsel sobers him up a bit. In the end, The best choice for him would be to plead guilty and cooperate, but he has proven throughout his professional life he doesn't always make the best choices.
But Frank, what would make him act so weird other than some sort of faith either in his innocence, which from his own statements to campaign officials in the media doesn't seem like anything even he believes, or the fact that he believes either implicitly or otherwise he has a pardon coming his way from Donald Trump?
Yeah, I'm a strong advocate of the theory that Stone is positioning himself for a pardon and that it's likely the only hope he has. I think that years from now, behavioral scientists will study Roger Stone. He's a different animal, and because he's driven by different motivators than the average human being. He seems driven and motivated merely by absolute publicity, absolutely being in the center of things, regardless of whether it's bad publicity or good publicity. He needs to be there, and he seems to be shaded toward the negative. He wants to be infamous, not famous. And so when you've got that motivating factor for you, you can throw the rules out the book with regard to whether someone will cooperate or not. The key to getting him to cooperate, if it ever happens, is going to be to press that button that says, Roger, you are going to be talked about forever, and you want it done in a way that preserves your legacy as doing what's right for you and for America. We can turn this around. That's going to be a very difficult sell for him.
Frank, he doesn't want that. Let's talk about his legacy. You have to understand this man's brand. He branded himself with Richard Nixon on his back. Think about that for a second. He prides himself on being notorious, on being part of this kind of underground, this deep state conspiracy type stuff. His entire legacy, his entire raison d'etre will go down the tubes if he flips. And by the way, I think the federal guideline sentence, he's looking at less than a year. I think this man would relish going to prison for 6 months as a martyr, coming out, writing his books, having a TV show, being the guy that would not turn. It would be so off-brand for him to do what anybody would traditionally do. Now, if he was staring at 10 years, that's a difference. But the stuff they have him on right now, which according to, I think, federal guidelines, I'd like to go back, obviously, to Frank or Chuck, is less than a year. He will do that time in a heartbeat versus flipping and celebrate it.
It's such a craven sort of thing to assert. I don't disagree with you, but these are the closest political allies of the President of the United States. Frank, you want to respond to that real quick?
Yeah, a couple of things. We don't know yet whether there's superseding indictments coming with Stone, more charges that might be hung over his head if he fails to cooperate, or if Mueller develops evidence in the interim that there is knowledge on his part about the role of Russia, the role of WikiLeaks. And so this could get much worse for him in terms of prison time. The other part of this is, you know, it sounds good to say I can write books and go on TV, except, of course, if perhaps, and Chuck can weigh in on this, the prosecution moves to bar personal profit after a conviction. And so this could get pretty interesting for Stone if things get worse in terms of prison time and his inability to profit from this.
Carol and then Chuck.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that, you know, all things being equal right now, I agree with Donnie. Like, this is not a person who's inclined to flip in any way. I mean, this is someone who has said that hate is a stronger emotion than love. This is someone who has, you know, left his hearing today and talked to Alex Jones, where he said that this is a lynching, and he talked about they being out to get him. I mean, his entire persona is built around this idea of being a victim, of being somebody who's under attack. And we've seen you know, him do this even on a much smaller scale of accusations. You know, we go back to when he was, you know, it came out that him and his wife were trying to be swingers. You know, he denied that and said the FBI was out to get him. And so this whole theme of Roger Stone's entire life would have to completely upend, and he would do an entire 180.
Today's act of mercy will be, I'm not going to make Chuck Rosenberg weigh in on Roger Stone's swinger phase, but I do want to ask you one more question, Carolee, about the news today of these close associates to Donald Trump, because at the end of the day, the Stone story and the Cohen story are Trump stories. These are the people, and with all due respect, I know he's your friend, these were dirty bad guys who did dirty bad things for the president. They are both, one heading to Congress to face the people in the body to whom he lied, the other one in court today facing 7 felonies. These are the president's closest political fixers.
And we've seen already him try to distance himself from some. He hasn't necessarily done that with Roger Stone. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. out and how the president treats him. But, you know, the question, Nicole, has always been, when does does Donald Trump pay a price for that? People kind of knew this about him to a certain extent. We're seeing more detail about it, but this was built in, and he's also, you know, created a picture to say, where he can say, you know, well, these were people who were working for me, and, you know, they were doing this, and nothing that he said prior to that, like, you know, I hire the best people, seems to matter to the people who are most staunchly in support of him.
That's to his brand, but criminally, if someone is putting together a conspiracy case and it involves the president, these people are now, one of them a convicted felon, the other one charged with felonies.
Well, I want to just throw a question at Chuck. You know, we keep talking about the senior campaign official, and as you know, when you build a case, you're building up, you're building down. Is there anybody other than Donald Trump Jr. or Jared who could fit that description, as far as when we're really rounding out all the president's men?
That's a great question. It seems like that circle is relatively small, Donnie, but I wanted to point out one other thing. Should the president pardon, let's say, Roger Stone, and I think it carries at least political, if not legal, jeopardy for the president, Roger Stone would no longer have a Fifth Amendment privilege to refuse to testify. He could be put in the grand jury and he can be compelled, something they can't do right now while he's pending indictment. And so not every avenue that seems to be immediately appealing for the president is really all that appealing. I mean, Roger Stone would benefit from a pardon, but the government would then have unfettered access to his testimony.
I want to just sort of end on this idea of how the goalposts constantly move. We are now all sitting here, even we talk about this every day. It's not that bad, you know. Roger Stone's brand. It's not bad for Roger Stone's brand. Oh, Michael Cohen.
I'm not saying it's not bad. I'm trying to analyze what he's going to do.
This is the president of the United States. He sits atop the Justice Department, which runs the FBI. The president's still coming down firmly on the side of felons, liars, and idiots.
Well, I mean, but Roger Stone was somebody who was part of the president's campaign. I mean, he left early, but he was still always an advisor. I mean, he's someone who's been tied closely to the president. He was at the Republican convention. I mean, he's not an unknown entity. So, you know, again, I think that people who are very strong supporters of the president don't see this like that necessarily. They see this as part of what's been built into Donald Trump and who he is. And the question, though, is where it goes. And that's something that none of us really know for sure, and will depend, and how this all unfolds will depend on how his support.
I have a prediction. Speaking of criminal enterprises, I really believe this ends with a RICO charge from the Southern District. I think that this is where this all ends, is that there can always be these gray areas with the Mueller investigation, unless literally he's on the phone with Putin. But when they start picking that enterprise apart, and you now have a sitting president who is sitting atop a RICO criminal enterprise, I think that's where this goes.
And that's something that politically, you know, the president hasn't necessarily guarded against. He's guarded against Russia, collusion, witch hunt, but the business portion of his company and things like that, he's not. That is not as primed for people sticking with him through that.
Really quick, Chuck, 20 seconds. I don't know that Matt Whitaker meant to say what he said yesterday about Mueller being almost done. I've heard other Justice Department officials caution against putting a timeline or an end-by date on the Mueller probe. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that, Nicole. And by the way, Donnie hit on a really important point. Even if Mueller is done, even if he files a report, there's still a Southern District of New York investigation. And whatever they may end up charging, that's ongoing and that's important. We ought to watch that very carefully.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.